Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this month's case study. We're excited to host Caroline Sherlock this morning for an interesting case study on the presentation of mast cell activation syndrome and mycotoxin illness on the NutrEval. Caroline is a registered nutritional therapist and a certified functional medicine practitioner. I won't go into too much more depth into her experience and qualifications, as I know she'll be talking a bit about that in the following slides. But in terms of logistics, as usual, the presentation will be roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So please, go ahead and write your questions in the question tab on the GoToWebinar control panel as we go along. Just so you know, we will also be sending out the recording and the slides later on today in case you want to watch the webinar again. So without further ado, I'll let Caroline begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, and it's really nice to see so many people here have registered for this today, so that's great. So I thought I would just start with a little bit about me for those who don't know me. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I'm co-founder of Eat, Drink, Live Well, which is a virtual online clinic. And I've worked in clinical practice since 2005, so quite a while now. I started to get a lot more interested in functional medicine sort of midway through, I think when I was starting to teach it at ION, right at the beginning of when it became popular, and so I certified in it eventually. I did lots of trips to the States and certified in 2017. And I think really as a result of that, the client base that started to arrive at me became much more complex, and that was part of actually transitioning to an online clinic at that point, because I no longer had sort of people coming in off the street and local people. So we've been virtual for a while actually, and I've had a growing interest in brain fog for quite a while, and really in histamine. So I've done quite a lot on histamine intolerance, and from that area of histamine, I suppose, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today, it's sort of grown into mast cell activation syndrome, particularly over the last few years, where we have seen COVID activate some of those same pathways. And then really in the last 5 years or so, I suppose I've been working with mycotoxins in some depth, and really now, I was just saying to Anastasia, probably about 90% upwards of the client base that I have do have some sort of mycotoxin illness, and this is very relevant for both histamine intolerance and mast cell activation, as well as it's a big contributory factor. So I also am RECODE 2 certified with the Bredesen protocol, member of ICI in the States, and mold literate certified with Jill Christa. So yeah, I've done my CPD in this. So let me go on to the next slide, if it will let me. So what I thought I'd do today, just before we dive into the case study, is just do a really quick overview of these areas, just for some of you who may not be as familiar perhaps with some of the terminology and the areas, and I'm sure lots of you are already, but just a brief recap so I can then put the case study in context. So when we talk about histamine, it's really histamine intolerance, I think, is a word or a term that's bandied about quite a lot at the moment. But what we're really looking at there is an imbalance in the breakdown of histamine within the body versus the production or the intake of histamine within the body. And it's this accumulation that for some people is the problem. It's not an allergy. It doesn't cause anaphylaxis, and the big area that we hear about a lot is the sort of low histamine diet, or foods that are high in histamine. And to degrade the foods that are high in histamine, the very first port of call is the DAO enzyme really in the gut. So that's why an efficiently functioning gut is really important before we even do anything else around this area. And I have a lot of clients that come into me and they have Googled low histamine diet, or they've been put on a low histamine diet, and particularly the Swiss one is the one that is sort of the gold standard, but it is very, very restrictive. And some of these people actually have developed severe, I'd say, food anxiety now, and are really eating, sometimes between 5 and 10 foods, because they have eliminated so many different things and are not sure what's making a difference, and are now scared to reintroduce high histamine foods. So it's a big area. And you know, I think what we have to remember as well is histamine at the moment is bandied about again as, you know, being an issue. And yes, it can be an issue, but actually normal amounts of histamine are very beneficial for us. It entirely has a very, very good purpose within the body. You know, and with the immune system, you know, the mast cells within the body produce histamine, and the purpose of that is to attract the white blood cells and start that immune inflammatory process. So it has a beneficial role. In the gut, the histamine receptors, they help the production of stomach acid, so help with digestion of foods, and this is one of the negative effects sometimes of the medications that are used in terms of actually negatively impacting the gut microbiome, and I think we tend to forget that. As a neurotransmitter, it helps us keep awake, circadian rhythm and cognition, and in the cardiovascular system, dilates blood vessels, permeability of capillaries, blood clotting. You know, it has a very, very useful role. And then the smooth muscle contractions and bronchoconstriction as well that we see structurally. So those are just some of the roles of histamine, and it's important. Where it can go wrong though is when we have the histamine overload, and this is where it can get quite confusing when we get people into clinic and they have all these seemingly unrelated symptoms. And it took quite a long journey for me, and it really was actually sort of doing my own genetics and seeing my own histamine genes and associating those with some of the symptoms I'd experienced over the years that really got me into this area. But it can just be all over the place, unrelated, and this is why it can be so hard to know where to start with some of these people as well. So you've got all the gastrointestinal issues, which can very much mimic IBS. And there's been some research around histamine and IBS issues, and really it's sort of histamine intolerance in a large part of those, or a large component of those IBS studies. Histamine has been involved. Reflux, nausea, vomiting, motion sickness is quite a big flag. Food sensitivities. We have all the neurological issues, so frequently my client base, it's brain fog. But it's also anxiety, a lot of anxiety around it, panic attacks, and this memory loss, this feeling of not being able to find words. So it's the executive function that seems to go particularly, and insomnia, because part of histamine's role is to keep us awake. So too much histamine really is related to a lot of insomnia cases that I see in clinic as well. And so playing around with that can actually help increase the deep sleep and restful sleep. Cardiovascular, lots and lots of things: dizziness, vertigo, headaches, migraines, a big one, blood pressure, POTS as well, easy bruising, tinnitus, a whole lot there. Skin, the classic thing with histamine is the flushing that you would see, particularly in relation to alcohol, I suppose. So, you know, red wine, you get the flushing on your face. That's a histamine issue normally. Reactions to insect bites, lots of little clues that we can look at. And then the respiratory ones, hormonal imbalances, lots of hormonal imbalances triggered by histamine. A lot of this is also the menstrual pain, so that smooth muscle contraction, you know, can be due to overproduction of histamine as well. Low energy, we see a lot with chronic fatigue, fatigue in general, and something that's very common to histamine intolerance and also particularly mast cell activation is hypermobility. And there are lots of different figures, again, thrown around on that, but I would say a good 50% of the clients that I see, upwards to some other clinics, I think 80%, have hypermobility issues, which may or may not have been diagnosed as Ehlers-Danlos. But certainly some sort of hypermobility there. Muscle joint pains, fibromyalgia, and interstitial cystitis. So cystitis that keeps recurring and not just due to sort of UTIs. Finally, reactions to medications, including anesthetics, can be a sign of histamine intolerance. So that's a big introduction there. And then just tying that in with mast cell activation syndrome. So mast cell activation and histamine intolerance are different, but they overlap, particularly when you look at the symptoms. So the big difference is that the mast cells release many inflammatory mediators, which would include histamine, but is not just limited to histamine. So you have a whole pro-inflammatory cascade going off, and many of the mast cells are very easily triggered and just are doing this sort of chronically the whole time, and that can be the big issue for many of these people. It's entirely possible to have MCAS without histamine intolerance, and also possible to have histamine intolerance without MCAS, just to confuse things more. Very difficult to diagnose either, so we do work with the clinical symptoms and what works, what doesn't work. Just to highlight the conventional approach, because if you are working in this area, the conventional medical approach to histamine intolerance, if it's recognized, but would be certainly the antihistamine medications. Sometimes you get some DAO in there as well, but it's normally just the antihistamines. And the MCAS approach would also involve mast cell stabilizing medication, as well as the antihistamines. So our approach differently, and I work, most of my clients are pretty much on the medications as well, so we're working in conjunction at the moment with the doctors. But our approach is to support the histamine breakdown and generation and stabilize the mast cells, but with using obviously the natural foods and supplements. And while we're doing that, we're personalizing the triggers based on their individual case histories and addressing them. So we look at genetics, we always look at the gut imbalances and the microbiomes, so something like a GI effects would be a perfect place to start with this. Infections, viruses, I would include COVID in that, certainly, Lyme. Stress is going to activate all of this more, and it's very difficult. It's a catch-22 with that one, so it can be quite hard to break that cycle. Hormones, big impact on both MCAS and histamine intolerance because of the estrogen receptors on the mast cells. So histamine will stimulate this estrogen, and estrogen then stimulates more histamine. And so we particularly see these symptoms worsening around perimenopause, menopause, and also sometimes teenage years when the hormones are fluctuating more. Toxins, massive one, including mycotoxins, and just generalized nutrient imbalances, which is why the NutrEval can be so important, and that's what we're looking at today. So just onto this third area, which is the mycotoxins as a MCAS trigger. Again, you know, this is the area that I've found myself working in predominantly now. So mycotoxins are the toxins produced from some mold spores. So the picture on the right is obviously sort of an extreme picture of black mold. Not every mold is going to produce mycotoxins, and sometimes these molds can be just quite stable, sitting there, not really doing very much, and oftentimes when it's moved, it's when they release the toxins. Not everyone is going to be susceptible to them as well. So there are big differences, and this is why you can have people in the same household that are, one is very sick and the others are okay, but they've still got the same mold exposure. You can get mycotoxins from foods, but water damaged buildings really are the prime source. So that's really what we look at, and the mycotoxin testing that we use, I mean, none of it is 100% and you know, totally reliable, but it's the best that we've got at the moment. But they are supposed to, the reference ranges really should account for kind of low level food exposure as well. And certainly within the EU, we have quite good regulations around mycotoxin levels. So maybe a current exposure or a prior exposure to mold. So it doesn't have to be now, it could be 20 years ago. Can be visible mold, can be hidden molds, and particularly if someone has air conditioning or heating that circulates around the house, a lot of these things can just be recycled around. Symptoms are not necessarily correlated with the area of exposure, meaning you could have a patch that is about the size of a playing card, and that would affect someone badly, or you could have a large patch and the net results in terms of symptoms could be the same. And again, not everyone is susceptible. So they're found frequently in those suffering from histamine intolerance and MCAS, and the impact of them, as I've said, is that they stimulate the mast cells. It's like kind of continually poking at the mast cells. They aggravate anxiety levels, create inflammation. They can penetrate through the blood-brain barrier, so they create neuroinflammation, as well as the gut barrier, and just lead to this excess inflammatory mediator production. And just sort of a summary there of everything that, you know, we would look at in terms of mycotoxin action. So lots and lots of different reactions, but particularly around mitochondrial dysfunction, cell danger response, those that are familiar with that, potentially activating the cell danger response, structural, intestinal inflammation. They're carcinogenic as well. They're not good. And a lot of this research comes from animal studies. They're much further ahead than we are with the human studies. And it's very strictly regulated in animal feed, actually. So, but lots and lots of actions, which is why the clients come in and they are incredibly complex, and it can be very hard to know where to start. So this is what I wanted to kind of demonstrate with you today, is when you have got so many symptoms going on, so many different things that people have done so much already, visited many different doctors, other practitioners, and things are still going on, where on earth do you start? So, client overview. This is Rachel, who I'm currently working with, and she is very much a work in progress. We're not at the end of her journey by any means, but we have made some dents in things, and so I thought it was useful to show you actually something that is ongoing, rather than a nice, very clear cut, awful at the beginning and then everything resolved by the end, because the reality is that this stuff takes time and it's not always that simple. And as the clients will say, it's very much 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that seems to be the pattern, with most of the clients that we work with and how it goes. But she is 51, really highly motivated, driven. And this is the case as well, because these people want to know what's wrong with them. So I don't see the people that are just content to just sit there and kind of be ill. They want resolution. They want to understand what's wrong. The problem is that they're driving themselves mad by trying to figure it all out themselves, and they're with different practitioners who give different views on what's going on. So they become highly anxious and stressed just through the amount of information they're trying to process. So it's a big commonality in this client base. She's a perfectionist. She runs her own business, so she has to be clear-headed. She has to be energetic. She needs to do that. So she's doing that on the screen, but then away from the screen, when she's not seeing her clients, she's kind of collapsing in the background, which is clearly not great. High demands on her teenage children, caring for parents, elderly parents as well, whose health is not great at the moment. Very, very overwhelmed. Lives in Scotland. She lived in a very old damp house for 20 years, and it also emerged recently that the holiday house that she has in France and escapes to in the summer also has damp, and is pretty much built on the soil, from what I can understand, and sort of damp rocks at the back of it. Her goals, quite simply, were to raise energy, better manage histamine intolerance, which she'd self-diagnosed, MCAS, and menopausal symptoms. So, a lot of the goals that these people have, they just want their lives back. They just want to be able to do things again. Her timeline, very interesting when we looked at it. Also, Scotland as well, we haven't yet investigated Lyme, but a lot of the clients that I have spent quite a lot of time outdoors as well, and sort of Lyme symptoms and co-infections mirror very, very closely MCAS, mycotoxin symptoms. So often they're very much tied up together, but we tend to leave Lyme and co-infections towards a bit further on in the program once we've done the initial work. So age 10, first known mold exposure. Her family home was damp. She remembers her mother saying that she had facial swelling, and her mum would say to her, oh, it's just because of the damp in the house, the mold. So, right from a very early age, mold exposure. 20s, onset of high anxiety. And histamine intolerance, when she first started to look at it, actually, sort of very high reactivity to insect bites, so bites that wouldn't go down and would be raised for weeks, very much different, I suppose, to her friends at the time. Age 29, she moved into a very old house, got married, moved into an old, lovely, lovely house, but had flooding, water leaks, didn't really think anything of it. And I think this is the case, particularly in the UK. We just accept that things are damp and things are wet and a bit mouldy somewhere, and wipe it off, and, kind of that's okay. But she lived there for 20 years, so consistently with these water leaks. By age 35, she was noting bleeding gums, sinusitis, fungal issues, so sort of thrush, candida, insomnia, nightmares, tired. So this is really, her symptoms are escalating at this point. And then at age 41, she had electively had her ovaries removed because she had a family history of ovarian cancer. Watched her aunt and also her mother, and she decided she didn't want to risk that. It was causing her a lot of stress and anxiety. So went into surgical menopause, and this is where things started to tip the balance as well, because very often, as I said at the beginning, with just histamine intolerance alone, when you suddenly reintroduce estrogen, for instance, there can be a poor tolerance of that, and sometimes progesterone as well. So as soon as she started to replace the hormones, her symptoms very much got worse. She had flushing, palpitations, MCAS, so that's multiple chemical sensitivities, to the point where she can't go into a room where anyone has perfume on. She can't go out and eat. She can't be exposed to any of these chemicals because it will set her off and put her into what she calls a flare. She had a CFS diagnosis at the same time because she was so tired, and SIBO, and was diagnosed by a doctor or practitioner at the time. But so SIBO started age 41. She's now 51, so that's been on and off over the last 10 years. Age 44, she went on a low histamine diet and started to restrict foods, as many people do. Age 47, her immune system just dipped and just totally couldn't recover from infection. So it's one cold after another cold, just very, very low the whole time. And then age 49, she finally moved out of the moldy house into a new house. So that's her timeline, what's happened over the years so far. And by the time she arrived with me, age 51, so obviously we've had COVID in between as well. She had COVID a couple of times. She's also had 4 vaccinations because she's so terrified of getting ill. These have led to flares as well each time she's had them, which again is quite common in some people with MCAS. She's got multiple symptoms, really wants to work on getting the hormones in properly. Her anxiety is off the scale, both with foods and her health, and the fact that she's not been able to tolerate the HRT going in, and yet knows that she needs it, and her gynecologist and menopause consultants are pressing her to just keep going with the HRT, to just get it in whatever, because she needs it. So this whole bundle of anxiety, and unfortunately that's led her to just become so anxious and stressed about everything. Her foods at this point were limited as well. The sensitivities, bladder pain as well, a lot of bladder pain, panic attacks, dizziness, fatigue, vision issues, which again is very common, particularly with mycotoxins. Constipation, bloating, not going to the loo for sort of 4 days, and a lot of bloating. She just restarted the HRT, totally overwhelmed, and at this point her diet was gluten-free, dairy-free, low histamine, low oxalate, vegetarian, lots and lots of oats coming in, and she's worked with a practitioner, but she'd also self-selected to come off a lot of the foods. But at this point she wasn't really eating anything else and was far too scared to actually reintroduce anything because she didn't know what it was going to do to her. Prior tests that she had done, 2018, she'd had a SIBO test, and the latest SIBO test, I think that was, and it was addressed and partially resolved. There was a GI effects in 2018. So all of this information actually was really useful to look back on. At the time of the GI effects, she had low short-chain fatty acids and butyrate. And so when we see that, we start to think about, is the mucosal layer robust? Is it able to actually produce the DAO enzyme at all if there are histamine intolerances there? So the mucosal layer is really important in terms of addressing all of this. There were high sulfur and methane producing species at the time, and also borderline high oxalobacter, so oxalate degrading bacteria as well, which ties in very much with a picture of mycotoxins and fungal overgrowth. 2021, she had an oral microbiome test, which we don't think was addressed. She had high levels of a pathogenic Tannerella forsythia and also Fusobacterium, which was very high, which does show up sometimes in the gut tests, but it's both just highly inflammatory. May 2021, she'd had mycotoxin testing, but this wasn't addressed at all. And it had come back actually, you know, it was only diving through all of the prior tests that she'd had done, we discovered she'd done this. So she's done so much already, but it's just this section was not addressed at all. And on her mycotox test, which I'll show you in a minute, she had ochratoxin A, which is a mycotoxin from Aspergillus molds. She had eniatin B, which is from Fusarium mold. She had a mycophenolic acid present, but it was within the reference range. And citrinin, so basically 3 out of reference range. And it's my experience that the more you have loaded on, the bigger the toll on the body. Lots of adrenal function tests. 2022 were the latest ones. And at that point, her DHEA was dipping, but just within range. And throughout, there had been this cortisol dysregulation, as we would expect, really, I think, with the amount that stress she's under. So these were the mycotox test results. And how we read these is we just look at the black bar and we see where those levels are within the reference range. I have to say these reference ranges or her levels are not hugely high, but it's the load that when they're loaded on to each other. And what I didn't show there was the low level mycophenolic acid as well. And they're just really strong immune suppressants. So she's got these ones that are just sitting there and nothing had addressed to date. So the initial steps, we wanted to do some additional tests, you know, straight off. So that was in there. So we kind of put her on this sort of holding protocol until we got results back. First points were really to work with her around her food and nutrient intake because she just really wasn't eating enough. So she agreed to trial some foods that she'd been avoiding, which included some of the higher histamine foods. And we just really took a very gradual approach to this in terms of getting her to sit down. A lot of lifestyle stuff, actually, which we can overcomplicate, but actually it was just really sitting down, choosing food she really had been missing, and introducing them, not high histamine foods, but she'd kind of been avoiding pretty much everything, and high oxalate foods, which wiped out a lot of the plant foods. So we started off with sort of some green leafy vegetables, so she could get those in. We got some low-level fruits back in, we got pomegranate in, and some of the other, just diversified. She hadn't been eating any animal protein at all as well, so was just kind of exhausted. So we experimented with that, and she's tolerated that pretty well, actually, and got some confidence in doing that. She was sensitive to supplements, so we really couldn't use many supplements, and that's very common with this group of people. But we did start to stabilize the mast cells a little bit. She was able to tolerate black cumin seed oil, which is just one of the alternatives that we can use to help do this. And we talked a lot about vagal nerve support and limbic system retraining, just to calm down the whole nervous system, so that, for instance, when she was going to trial a new food, she wasn't in a stressful state about it. So this initial protocol kind of diversified off into a lot more kind of lifestyle things, and we had her buy a Sensate, for instance, which is very good. It's a little device, for those who don't know it, that sits there and can help just calm down and rebalance the vagal nerve as well. Lots of things around that in this initial phase. We did work on her gut as the main issue at this point as well, particularly around the constipation. So I wanted to reduce her transit time. And she was able to tolerate vitamin C, magnesium, and we also managed to get a motility support supplement in there as well, and just some powders to support the mucosal lining, just in order to support DAO production, basically. Oral microbiome support, we put her on some toothpaste and mouthwashes, and she booked in to see the dentist. And on the mycotoxin area, it just has never been addressed. So her priority was to, at this point as well, to actually assess her house, her environment, and get people in to look at whether there was a current exposure, because what we needed to know was whether this was I mean, certainly it was a prior exposure, but if you have mycotoxin exposure at the current time, whatever you do, it is not really going to tip the balance over. So it was a real priority to assess her current house that she'd moved into, at the same time as going back to that gut, because and opening the detox pathways and resolving the constipation, because the last thing you want to do is try to move mycotoxins around, but then have them recycle around the body. So addressing the gut was the right way forward at this point. And then the testing, she was so anxious about the hormones going in that we did a Dutch test. We did some nutrigenomic testing, and then we did the NutrEval. Nutrigenomic results actually were really encouraging for her, because her histamine intolerance on the genetic side really was not, was not that great. Yes, she had a little bit, but very clear on the pathways, and certainly not a total disaster zone. So that actually helped her alleviate some of the anxiety and things she'd been working around. There's attention to choline, yes, a slight predisposition towards estrogen dominance, big predisposition towards inflammation, and also stress. So this really enhanced what we were doing with the vagal nerve and the limbic system support, in terms of it's absolutely crucial for her to manage stress levels and find ways to relax. And finally, her detoxification pathways were compromised, particularly around glutathione, which is one of the main pathways for mycotoxins to get out of the body, as well as glucuronidation, which is the other big pathway as well. So she had SNPs around those. Her Dutch test, estrogen really low, also progesterone. So she's gone back to the gynecologist, and she's just actually had bloods done as well, which have again shown that. So she is going to persevere with a more appropriate form of HRT. Her DHEA at this point is low as well, so that's dipped, and the continued cortisol dysregulation. And so then the NutrEval results, which were obviously the big thing that we were waiting for, because there's so many ways that you can go off on a tangent and try to tackle MCAS because of the complexity of symptoms. So sometimes it is just simpler to have the data in front of you and to work with what is out of balance and bring it back into balance. And this is why I think, the NutrEval is a great test, because it does it very, very well. And it also presents it very, very clearly to the client. So this is the front page. So for those of you who have not run a NutrEval, and I'm sure lots of you have already, but you get this beautiful summary on the first page of actually what's going on. You can see from a glance here that her need for antioxidant support was huge. Her requirement for mitochondrial support, also huge, and her need for inflammation support, also huge. Marginally less huge, but still at a 7, was the toxic exposure. So, absolutely correlates with everything. But then actually really reassuringly, her methylation support, down at a 4, which is really good to see, because sometimes there's a tendency to just go in quite heavy on the methylation side of things, or maybe even the traditional kind of energy supporting nutrients and CoQ10, etc. And it really does just clarify what you need to focus on by looking at this. So we can see, the main things just from this front page. She's got raised lipid peroxides, a need for glutathione, raised 8-hydroxy dehydrogenase, which is the marker of DNA damage, and then a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction, and her omega-3 index is low. And then obviously sort of the toxic exposures. But when we're looking at something like MCAS, one of the therapeutic interventions that we can use to promote those anti-inflammatory pathways obviously are omega-3 fats. And so actually having this data behind it is really hugely useful in order to tailor the supplement requirements as well. And this is the next page. So again, if it just makes it super easy in terms of where to start with people. And you can see at a glance here that her antioxidant need, it's not just kind of just in the red, reference range. The ones that are there, alpha lipoic acid, glutathione, plant-based antioxidants, they're firmly up there. And vitamin A, C, and E, also there, little bit CoQ10 as well. But, I think there's a big correlation. The alpha lipoic acid helps to recycle glutathione, for instance. So a lot of these things tie together. as does vitamin C. B vitamins, you know, again, you think energy, you think chronic fatigue diagnosis, she's exhausted all the time, let's load her up with B vitamins. Not really necessary, actually. And interesting, you know, it's the B2 that really has come out as a high requirement here. So that actually is what we're focusing on at the moment. And what you'll find as well sometimes with a lot of people that have mycotoxin illness is that they're often not able to tolerate many supplements, which might include digestive enzymes, but particularly the B vitamins because of the way that they are formulated and made. So anything fermented can be an issue, and it's often the case that the B vits, you know, being fermented, are just not tolerated. So whilst in an ideal world I would love to just go in with a base multi and then just load up, for this client base it just doesn't really work because they're too reactive. So we need to go in, unfortunately, one by one with the nutrients to assess their tolerance, and it's very often changing different forms of it as well. You know, and for instance, her, you know, glutathione we have managed to get in, but she's been through about 3 or 4 different brands and not tolerated, you know, 3 of them. The one she's with now she can tolerate, but you know, it's very sensitive in terms of what we can get in, and it's very slow progress, unfortunately, too. Magnesium she needs, a little bit of manganese, omega-3s, digestive support, yes, there's still gut stuff going on. We haven't rerun GI effects, but we will be at some point. And her vitamin D, you know, kind of crucial to know. And this is the nice thing about the NutrEval, is that you get so much information just all in one test. Now, what we see here again, so with mycotoxins and with MCAS, you know, the mitochondrial function very often dips. Very often it doesn't dip. So sometimes we run these panels and actually the mitochondrial function comes back absolutely fine, which is great in terms of then not diverting time and resources to tidying up the Krebs cycle, essentially. This is not the case with this one. Her mitochondrial function is very much compromised. And so this is a big area of focus for us, actually, just in supporting her in terms of energy as well. And you can see right from the top here, so she's her adipic acid and suberic acid on the fatty acid oxidation, they're high initially, so she's not using optimally that beta oxidation pathway. When we come down from the carbohydrates in terms of energy production, her pyruvic and her lactic acid are good. So that is actually very encouraging in terms of, you know, for her, we didn't want to just put her on a keto diet, and her diet was all over the place anyway, but she is actually able to utilize the energy from certain carbohydrates. So we're keeping carbohydrates in for her. But you can see once it gets to acetyl coenzyme A and then down into the citric acid cycle, it's almost like every single marker is compromised. So her citric acid, her cis-aconitic acid, isocitric, succinic acid, malic acid. So this citric acid cycle is very, very much compromised. And when you look at the NutrEval, you know, you've got the red dots on the right-hand side of it, which indicate the role of toxins coming in and affecting the cycle. And the toxins that are cited on this page are very much sort of the metals, so the lead, mercury, etc., which are absolutely factors. But mycotoxins also affect this cycle. And what we tend to see with a mycotoxin panel is that particularly succinic acid is one that is raised because it kind of diverts the cycle off a little bit. So succinic acid is one of the first ones I look at with MCAS and mycotoxins in particular as a clue, actually, as to whether there's toxic involvement. But all of hers are raised, and what we deduced from this, so she'd obviously had a wealth of blood tests from the doctors. We knew her iron levels actually were within range. But what motivates this pathway to circle round nicely is actually glutathione. And because of the role, particularly ochratoxin A and citrulline to a certain extent, they go through it. There's a big pull on glutathione, and when you've got inflammation going on in the body, it's glutathione that mops it up. And her genetics were such that she just doesn't produce glutathione very well. So our interpretation at the moment is that the toxicity is impacting the citric acid cycle, and that's why we are actually working with the glutathione pathways at the moment to try to impact this. Vitamin B2 as well features, so that is another rationale for adding in the B2 as a priority, just to try to get some movement here. It's also the fact that, and this is where it becomes quite interesting in terms of the type of mycotoxins, the N-iatin B that she had, one of the roles of N-iatin B is to disrupt the mitochondrial function. So it really, they all do to a certain extent, but there's quite a good link with the N-iatin that she has within her as well. So whilst we're working with all of these things, the end goal obviously is to get these mycotoxins out of her. This then just falls down into, you know, sort of the NADH, FADH in the electron transport train. She's got high lipid peroxide. She's got a lot of damage to that membrane. Her CoQ10 here looks okay, but again, glutathione and the raised 8-hydroxy at the end are an issue. So really sort of crying out for antioxidants to come in. And organic acids, you know, as saying to Anastasia before, we don't look at every single marker here that's out of range. But there's, you know, certainly something going on with the gut still that we do need to address and re-look at. At the moment, you know, we cannot get any sort of herbal or antimicrobial in, so this is what we're aiming towards at the moment, and then we will rerun a GI effects after that. But one of the things that stands out is benzoic acid here in the dysbiosis markers section, and this can be food. She wasn't eating a lot of fruits, so a lot of these markers can be elevated by fruit consumption, but that wasn't really the case with her. Benzoic acid, she was actually using a lot of personal care products that had sodium or benzoates added as preservatives that she hadn't been looking at. So she's now, as a knock-on effect of this NutrEval, she has looked at all her shower gels and shampoos and has really revamped those as well, because even a lot of the organic ones tended to have this in. So she's taken that out as a trigger as well. A little bit on the fungal markers, you know, but this is not hugely raised. Very often with mycotoxins, we do actually see those raised significantly more, but this is not the case here. The glutaric acid is really kind of that vitamin B2 again. And this is just the, what did I want to say on this? So this is just the bar chart of the energy, the mitochondrial cycles. And just highlighting up at the top, the kynurenic acid and the quinolinic acid. I like to check that as well, particularly when there's brain fog, because the quinolinic acid is neurotoxic to the brain. So we want to make sure that those are nicely within the green. She's kind of just in the green on those, but it's at least not in the red. So we're not looking at playing around with that pathway to impact her brain fog. And then the toxin markers at the bottom, pyroglutamic acid is glutathione. She's also got some MTBE, which is very, very common. But as a result of this, she's also had people into the house and installed a water filter, because it's mostly the case that the MTBE that we find is just in the water now, because of the, it stems back to kind of the gasoline and just contamination of the water supply. So she's got a water filter in to try to alleviate that. And what we're really doing is just taking as much inflammation away as possible from her. She's got some dysfunctions in the oxalate markers, so we're not going mad on oxalate foods, but we're also not really restricting them. Her oxalic acid is okay, and it's more the glyceric acid that is raised there. So again, we're working with B vitamins, and actually mycotoxins push this up. There's a big correlation with oxalates and mycotoxins, and I think that's what we probably saw in the prior GI effects, where there were borderline high levels of oxalobacter as well. They were just helping to mop up all these oxalates that were being produced at the time. And blood glutathione low as well, or borderline low. So certainly some work to do around that. Her amino acids were fine. Yeah, this page, and you know, and you can see as well, what are we doing? So there's the serine, yeah, so a few raised markers, but actually nothing too much on this page as well. So that was quite a nice page for her. And then the upshot really of her omega-3s, and this is the slight issue, because with MCAS and histamine issues, fish can be quite problematic in terms of accentuating symptoms. So a lot of people, when you look at kind of the low histamine diets online, it's sort of avoid all fish unless it's flash frozen. So people just don't eat fish as well. And then my experience is that they become scared of fish oil capsules. So also don't take those because they think it's raising their histamine load. So what we have agreed, because ultimately we want to dampen down the inflammation, so we're using this as a, okay, your omega-3 index is just too low, we need to improve your omega-3 levels. So at the moment she is trialing some frozen salmon, so we're trying to do it through diet, because she is preoccupied at the moment with raising the HRT, and we can't do too many things at one time. Everything has to be one at a time, so it just takes a long time to get these things in. But we're trialing fish initially, and then if she's okay with the little fish, we will move on to omega-3 supplements to help to tackle this. And elements, so, you know, quite a good section actually. And what I really wanted to see with this, and this again is the value of the NutrEval, is, you know, you get the markers for lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, because this can so much mimic and interrupt those mitochondrial pathways as well, you know. So we just want to make sure, and although this is just the whole blood, you know, there's obviously other ways of measuring elements, whether it's urine and hair, etc. But you know, this gives a good glance, because if mercury had been high on this, then, or lead for instance, as is frequently the case in ones that I test actually, then, you know, it just directs you to a different pathway in terms of dealing with this. But there's nothing high here, so we're parking that really for the moment. And vitamin D low, so need to address that. And homocysteine actually okay. So again, you know, her methylation okay. And then just finishing off, just to let you know what we're doing at the moment. So we're supporting her vitamin D levels. Her vitamin C, magnesium, and the motility supplements that we've put in have resolved her constipation, which is fantastic. And because she no longer has the constipation, we've been able to put in a particular binder to support binding onto the mycotoxins. So we're beginning to work with helping to support mycotoxin reduction. If we had put the binder in at the beginning, because she was so constipated, it was not helping. It was making the constipation worse. So resolving that transit time and making sure that she is going to the toilet every day has been hugely beneficial. Some bile support, vitamin B2, glutathione. As I said, we've been through a few brands. One brand is tolerated, and she notes she feels massively better now she's got the vitamin B2 and glutathione in. So just those two supplements alone. We've got some rhodiola just for low-level adrenal support. And then really working on the dietary expansion. So she has her own chickens, but she hadn't been eating the eggs. So we've got eggs back in, you know, for choline, frozen salmon, antioxidants via plant foods at the moment rather than supplements, the water filter. She's got a HEPA air filter just to reduce chemical sensitivities, and she's looking for the benzoates in food and personal care products. Progress, bowel movements normalized, no bloating, and this is, you know, the biggest thing. People just want to feel normal. They just want their lives back. So the biggest thing for her was, you know, she said she's eaten out in a cafe with a friend for the first time in years, and was able to actually eat something and have a cup of something. And she was also really excited about the various holidays she's got planned away this year, which was really nice to see. She's working with her vagal nerve. She's constantly derailed by flu, colds, COVID infections, which is very common with mycotoxins because they suppress the immune system, but each time she's having a quicker recovery and no lasting fatigue. She's working with the HRT at the moment. She's at the dentist and has been, I think last week actually, they found areas of inflammation sort of around the wisdom teeth, so she's tackling all that. So we're reducing that inflammation in terms of the oral microbiome. And she also feels supported, which I think is one of the main things that people want. They want to be listened to and not see different practitioners in isolation. They just want one person who can liaise with everyone and you know, understand what's going on with them. So next we will work with hopefully some of the plant-based antioxidants in supplement form, alpha-lipoic acid and resveratrol probably. We're trying to progress onto some antifungals, support the detox pathways, limbic system retraining, stress management, and we will repeat the mycotoxin test, or also GI-effects actually, depending on progress, and a repeat metabolomics, which is the urinary portion of this, at some point as well. So that just gives an idea of where she is right now. And as I said at the beginning, it's very much a work in progress. So that's everything. I hope that's been useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Caroline. Super, super interesting case study. I'm sure many of the participants will agree with that. Very complex, gosh.
Yeah.
Very complex case.
Gone are the days of just wanting to lose weight or balance blood sugar.
Yeah, if only it was so straightforward, right? So we have quite a few questions that have come in. The first one's from Lorene. She is wanting to know what the specific vision issues are in relation to mycotoxicity, and perhaps what the mechanism behind that could be too.
So blurred vision particularly, and also sort of migraine sensitivity to light as well. And the issues, we believe, one, it's just that sort of antioxidant support that is not there, the glutathione, the carotenes that are needed for eyesight, vitamin A, so just on a strict nutrient basis. But the other one is thought to be kind of the neuropathy as well, in terms of brain to the eye function. So one of the things we do as standard, well, I do as standard, when I start working with someone, is have them do something called a visual contrast sensitivity test as well, a VCS test, and that gives us a good idea of what's going on. But yeah, there are always vision issues involved, to greater or lesser degree.
And there's a website, right, where people can do the VCS test?
VCStest.com. There's a couple of them. There's just Shoemaker one, and I can never remember which is which, but VCStest.com. It's like, I don't know, $10 or something to do. It's really cool.
Yeah. So that's something that people can, add in if they suspect mycotoxicity, potentially before doing a mycotox test, maybe.
Yeah, it's not specific for mycotoxins, but so it's just biotoxins. So it could be lime, it could be chemicals, because it was developed, I believe, for in the Gulf War to measure airline pilots' ability to distinguish between kind of grey skies and landing because of the issue with biotoxins and vision. So I think that's how it was done.
I didn't know the history of that, so that's super interesting to know. Thank you. Okay, so another question from the same person, and I think we sort of touched on this before when we were chatting before the webinar. So she's saying that she's never seen a mycotoxin test normal and finds it hard to trust that a high level necessarily means a clinical relevance. Do you question the reference ranges ever at all?
Yeah, continually, and it's about the interpretation of it, and it's also about your experience as a clinician. So if someone has symptoms, if you're not getting resolution elsewhere and they've had an exposure, then I think it's worth testing it. Sometimes you can see levels go up, so it does depend on how well their detoxifications pathways are working. So it can be the case that you work with someone and actually their levels go up, and you think this is actually a disaster because they've gone up from where they were, but actually it's a really positive sign because they're getting them out of them. So, but the main thing is to make sure there's no exposure.
Sure. Okay. Another question here from Sally, who's asking about the nutrigenomic testing panels, or the genomic testing panels that you used. So specifically, do you mind sharing which panel you used for this particular client?
I use LifeCode. I work very closely with them on this area, and I tend to run about 5 panels, so which would include sort of hormones, histamine, nervous system, methylation, depending on so but I've used all of them out there at various points. And if someone's got 23andMe, I also would interpret those, but I tend to use Life Code at the moment.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose in relation to histamine, the most obvious one would be the histamine panel, right?
Yeah. You can see very clearly what's compromised and what needs support.
Yeah, brilliant. So a question here about the vagal nerve support that you provided. What were the specifics around that?
So just a lot of generalized support. So just the basic recommendations like gargling, singing if she feels like it, laughing, so if you're going to watch TV at night, actually put a comedy on rather than something that's going to bring you down. So very, very simple things like that. I tend to refer them to a number of resources as well, and I also refer to a couple of programs that DNRS, which is an American one, the Gupta program here as well. So a lot of my clients are doing those at the same time just to reset everything.
Okay. I'm just writing these things down as well as we speak. Okay, so a question here from Raki. Which company would you recommend to assess the home environment?
So there's a number of them out there, and they all add different things. At the moment, I'm referring to Building Forensics as a starting, and they also have there's a company, and I can't remember the website at the moment, that is affiliated with them that actually does testing as well. So if someone can't afford for someone to come out straight away, there are some good kind of home testing options that are available as well that I think you directed to. If you phone Building Forensics, and they would direct you on anyway.
Okay, and is it wide business?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, fab.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Question from Anka about the B vitamins that you have found are better tolerated.
Yeah, it varies with everyone. Sometimes we have to use sublingual, so folate and B12. Sometimes we have to open capsules and just literally do a pinch of something. P5P generally, and that's one of the ones that really comes out as people crying out for most of the time. I find that if there's one B vitamin to get in and that they tolerate, it would be that, and then it would probably be thiamine after that. They seem to be the less reactive, and I can get those into most people. But sometimes it is going to the drops, sometimes it's, as I say, literally opening capsule, pinch of something and building up. It's building it up. It's very, but then some people can just take, some people are fine, and that's the frustrating thing with it. There's no consensus. Some people can just take a multivitamin or just take a B complex, at which point, great.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I found that too with clients, that you get one person who is absolutely fine, same sort of presentation as the next person, but the next person, they're intolerant.
Yeah, and I find the liposomals, I'd love to use liposomal all the time, but they're just not well tolerated, unfortunately. And a lot of the client base have antiphospholipid antibodies as well, going on as well. So, but yeah, the liposomal we struggle with, and they're expensive mistakes when it doesn't work. So so yeah, supplements aren't easy.
Do you find that people are also quite sensitive to liposomal glutathione?
Yeah, very, very. So I generally wouldn't introduce that until kind of way down in the protocol. But sometimes they have done some of this themselves and experimented, and sometimes you look at their cupboards and they've got the stuff there already because they've read it might help. So, and that's quite useful to know, because if they've got a liposomal glutathione sitting there, it's very easy to say, well, let's just try that and see if it works.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And what do you think the mechanism is with that, particularly with glutathione? Is it the sort of sulfurous nature of it?
Yeah, it can be, and it just is it's too stimulatory. Mycotoxins at the end of the day don't want to be moved. They're very comfortable where they are. They do not want to be touched. They don't want to be moved around, aggravated, tamed, you know, so it's almost like you need to go in with a stealth mission, you know, and it's frustrating because often, you know, NAC would be the obvious to use beneath it, but the cysteine aggravates the sulfur pathways and sometimes the oxalates as well. So the cysteine can divert off to the oxalate pathways, which then makes their symptoms worse. So it's a tricky one. But if we can do glutathione, and there's a spray glutathione that I've used, I don't quite know how effective it is, but most people do tend to be able to tolerate the spray.
Okay.
And we work backwards.
In another way of sort of introducing something gradually rather than in a sort of teaspoon format. Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. The binder for the mycotoxin. So I've got a question here from Deb. Is there a specific binder that you typically use?
There's a few that I use, and you know, I think Remember Foods as well can be quite good binders, and Opera is your classic, you know, binder. You know, as well as just if someone is super sensitive, you can just start off with the fibers. It's just sort of anything to bind it. But the one I tend to use, if people tolerate it, would be GI Detox as a kind of broad spectrum.
Yeah, it has quite a number of those agents in there.
Yeah, I like it, but there are lots of other ones out there that, and I've used most of them actually. So sometimes it's a process of just going through the binders.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, that's that. And then, so a question from Andrea. There was a vagal support device that you mentioned. Is that right? What was it?
It's called a Sensate.
Oh yeah.
Okay. There's a couple of different ones, and obviously we can use supplements as well to support the vagal nerve, and part of sorting out the gut is, you know, instrumental in that, and choline. But the Sensate is quite nice, and it just kind of forces people to have a little bit of me time in their day. It's kind of like the size of a mouse, a computer mouse, and it vibrates. Oh, you've got one? Excellent. Okay, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, and it just makes people fit, you know, it just makes people calm down. You can set it for 10-20 minutes, and there's an app that has the audio alongside, so it works on a couple of different levels, and it's quite a nice device, I think. You know, if someone what do you think?
Yeah, I find it very comforting. It's even if it's just 10 minutes, you know, just in the middle of the day or whenever you can, really. I think it's also that sensory deprivation. You know, obviously you just have to lie down and close your eyes and tune into the sounds and the sensation, the vibration around your chest. And I think we're so used to sensory overload nowadays that it's nice to just calm everything down and just give yourself, even if it's just 10 minutes, I think it can be quite powerful.
I agree, and you know, obviously meditation and anything like that is super helpful, but I find that everyone's trying to do everything. They're trying to meditate, they're trying to go and sit down and be mindful, and that's just then adding more stress and anxiety to everything. So sometimes having something that just sits there and makes you just sit for 10 minutes, do nothing else, is quite a nice thing.
Yeah, and also I find meditation can sometimes be a little bit triggering for some people. You know, it's maybe a little bit too, how do I put it? You're sort of just left there with your thoughts and whatever sensations you're feeling in that moment. And so if you've suffered with trauma, for example, it can be quite triggering for some people.
I agree. So it's different things for everyone, and it's finding something that appeals to everyone. And again, they're all different. But yeah, for her, the Sensate worked.
Yeah, brilliant. Motility support. I've got a question here from Shweta. Is there any specific support that you use that you wouldn't mind sharing?
I use a lot of different ones. I think in this case, it was, I can't remember, I think it was colon cleanse. It was either a bowel mover or colon cleanse, and I can't remember which one it was, but they tend to work quite well. But I use a lot of, you know, You can look at obviously kind of motility in terms of B6 and 5-HTP, or you can look at the kind of triphala and the magnesium in vitamin C, and often at times it's the collection of everything. I think in this case it was colon cleanse. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm familiar with that one. Okay, fab. Time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, that's fine. Sure.
Okay, brilliant. So, let's see. The antifungal that you said that you would try with this client, I don't know whether you've already put that in or it's something that you're planning on putting in. Is there a specific one that you tend to use?
She has it and she's staring at it at the moment. She's so we are trialing with her biocidin, which is we're trialing drops because you can get them down to a quarter drop dosage first of all, and she's quite she's tolerating quite a few bizarre, not bizarre supplements, but like glutathione is fine. You know, she seems to be able to get certain things in. So for someone that's super sensitive, I may not use biocidin. I may do something a little bit simpler in terms of other companies, but it works. You know, it's the same company as GI Detox, so they work together quite well, just to see. And also because there's obviously some gut dysbiosis still going on there as well, it's quite nice to use something that does both sides of things. And I think that's the other thing just to mention with the different types of mycotoxins, they all bind onto something different, they all go through different pathways, and they all respond to different herbals slightly better as well. But when you've got a mix of them there, then it can be quite useful if someone can tolerate it to get in something like biocidin and a GI detox, because they're the blend of things.
Yeah, I see. And I guess going back to the point about titrating, if it's in a liquid, it's so easy to do that, and you can literally start off with just a drop, right?
Yeah.
Drops
a day and then try another drop. Yeah, so it's really up and down. Yeah.
And is there a particular time that you would anticipate having to use an antifungal for in the mycotoxin presentation?
So, I mean, I wouldn't just kind of standard, I wouldn't use it for more than 4 weeks. So it'd be maximum 4 weeks and then a break, and then we reassess where they are. Sometimes kind of pulsing it on and off can be quite useful, particularly if there's hypermobility and SIBO is perpetually going to be an issue with the, you know, the valves being quite weak and these cycles of SIBO coming back. So sometimes it can be quite useful just to pulse back in an antifungal or an antimicrobial for, you know, kind of 3 days every couple of weeks while we're still working on it. But very often I'll change it round. So we'll change up the binder and we'll change up the antifungal when we go in for the next round. But it's just constantly reassessing how they are, both clinically and, you know, on paper as to what's gone on, and making sure, obviously, I use a lot of the spore-based bacteria now as well alongside it, you know, so that you're making sure that you're keeping that microbiome as diverse as possible while we're doing it, particularly if they're limiting foods.
So would that be
react a lot to probiotics too.
I was just going to say, would that be your choice of a probiotic, a spore-based one?
There's a couple of, it depends on the microbiome results, and I don't have a current one, so I would tailor that normally to, you know, there's a limit to what tests you wanted to do at this point, and, you know, what we're going to do in the future. So I do use probiotics, but I use the non-histamine producing ones if there's a need, or isolate particular strains depending on what comes up in that, in a GI or something. I would really target it, but if it's just a generalized one, then yeah, they tolerate better the spore-based initially, I found. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, great. I think we'll leave it there. I think we've pretty much answered all of the questions. So thank you so much again, Caroline, for your time. Really appreciate it. I hope that it has been informative for everyone here attending. As I mentioned, I'll send the recording later on today, as well as the slides in PDF format, if you don't mind, Caroline. Is that okay?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. No,
brilliant. Thank you. So thank you so much. And of course, if anyone has any more questions that they feel hasn't been haven't been answered today, please feel free to get in touch with Caroline or with the FinEd team at Genova. And we'll look forward to speaking to you soon, Caroline.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Anastasia.
Take care.
Bye.
Speak soon. Bye.